Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of America's forgotten past. I'm your host, and tonight we descend into a tale so disturbing, so meticulously hidden, that it took nearly 4 years for the truth to surface. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it in your part of the world? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about sharing these stories across time zones. Knowing that somewhere it's deep night and somewhere else dawn is breaking over the very landscapes where these horrors unfolded. This is the story of the Rivera Inn, a story of seduction, betrayal, and systematic murder. A story that unfolded in 1851 in the remote backwoods of Kentucky, where 2 women turned hospitality into a death sentence. The year is 1855. It's late March, and Sheriff Clayton Mercer stands at the edge of a property that until 3 days ago was known simply as a roadside inn, a place where weary travelers could rest, eat, and find whatever comfort the night might offer. But Sheriff Mercer isn't here for rest. He's here because Judge Harlan Pritchard, a respected circuit judge from Louisville, vanished without a trace after staying at this very inn 6 weeks prior. Pritchard was a man of routine, a man who wrote letters to his wife every Sunday without fail. When those letters stopped, questions began. Now, as Mercer watches his deputies dig into the soft earth behind the inn's main structure, he understands with growing dread that this isn't just about one missing judge. The shovels strike something solid, not rock, not root, bone. By nightfall, they've unearthed 7 bodies. By the end of the week, the count rises to 23. And when the excavation finally concludes, after every suspicious mound of earth has been examined, after every depression in the ground has been investigated, the final tally stands at 43 graves. 43 men buried in shallow pits, their bodies wrapped in canvas or simply laid bare in the dirt. Their valuables stripped, their identities erased. The women responsible had already fled. Catalina and Violeta Rivera, 2 sisters who had run the inn for 4 years with charm, beauty, and a hospitality that men traveling through Kentucky found irresistible. But beneath the warm smiles and softer promises, something far more sinister had been unfolding. These women weren't just innkeepers, they were hunters. And every man who walked through their door became potential prey. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore passed down through generations and embellished with each telling. This is documented history, court records, sheriff reports, witness testimonies, and newspaper clippings from 1855 that describe the discovery as the most heinous crime yet committed in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Yet, despite the evidence, despite the bodies, despite the confessions extracted under interrogation, so much remains unknown. Why did they do it? How did they select their victims? And most hauntingly, were 43 really all of them? The Rivera Inn stood 7 miles outside the town of Willow Creek, along a road that connected Louisville to the smaller mining settlements scattered through the Appalachian foothills. It was far enough from civilization to offer privacy, close enough to the road to attract steady business. The perfect location for what the sisters had in mind. Travelers, prospectors, merchants, drifters, men with no family waiting, no one to miss them if they never arrived at their destination. These were the Rivera sisters' preferred guests. And for 4 years, no one suspected a thing. But what they found buried beneath the inn's foundation would rewrite everything we thought we knew about female criminals in 19th century America. Because this wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an act of desperate self-defense. This was methodical, calculated, and it had been happening week after week, month after month for nearly half a decade. Tonight, we're going to examine every piece of evidence. We're going to walk through the timeline, explore the testimonies, and try to understand how 2 women managed to kill 43 men without raising a single alarm. We'll look at the historical context, the social conditions that made such a crime possible, and the psychological profiles that might explain the sisters' actions. So settle in, turn off the lights if you dare, because this story doesn't end with the discovery of those graves. In fact, that's only where it begins. To understand how the Rivera sisters operated undetected for so long, we must first understand Kentucky in the 1850s. This was a state in transition, caught between the old agrarian South and the industrial ambitions of the North. The California gold rush of 1849 had sent thousands of men westward, but not everyone made it to California. Many stopped in Kentucky, drawn by rumors of coal and iron deposits in the eastern mountains. These men were transient, rootless, often traveling alone. They carried their wealth with them, cash, gold dust, property deeds, because banks were scarce and trust was scarcer. The roads connecting Louisville to the mining camps were rough, dangerous, and sparsely populated. Bandits were common. Accidents were frequent. If a man disappeared on such a road, it was rarely investigated. People assumed he'd been robbed and killed by highwaymen, or that he'd simply moved on to another territory. In this environment, the Rivera Inn thrived. The inn itself was a modest two-story structure built from Kentucky timber, with a wide front porch and shuttered windows that could be closed against the mountain cold. Historical records describe it as well-maintained if austere, with 6 guest rooms upstairs and a common area downstairs that served as both tavern and dining hall. There was a kitchen out back, a small stable for horses, and, though no one knew it at the time, a root cellar that would later yield disturbing evidence. Catalina and Violeta Rivera arrived in Willow Creek in the spring of 1851. According to the county land registry, they purchased the property from a widow named Essie Holcomb, who'd been trying to sell it for 2 years after her husband died of pneumonia. The sale price was suspiciously low, $30 and a promissory note, which later investigators found unusual, but at the time, no one questioned it. 2 women running. An inn alone was uncommon, but not unheard of. Widows and spinsters often took up such work out of necessity. What made the Rivera sisters memorable, however, wasn't their business acumen. It was their appearance. Every account from surviving witnesses describes them in strikingly similar terms. Catalina, the elder at 29, had black hair that fell to her waist and eyes like polished coal. Violeta, 26, was described as softer in features but equally captivating, with a voice that one traveler later recalled as the kind that makes a man forget his wife's name. They spoke English, with a slight accent that people assumed was Spanish, though some thought it might be French or Portuguese. When asked about their origins, they offered vague stories about growing up in New Orleans, about a father who'd been a ship captain, about coming north to escape the heat and the yellow fever outbreaks. The details changed depending on who was asking, but no one pressed them. Frontier America, reinvention, was common. People didn't ask too many questions about where you came from, only whether you could pay your debts and keep your word. The sisters ran the inn with meticulous efficiency. They served simple but hearty meals, stews, cornbread, salted pork. They kept the rooms clean. They charged fair prices, 50 cents for a bed, 25 cents for a meal, extra for whiskey. But what really drew men to the Rivera Inn, what made it a preferred stop along that lonely road, was the promise of something more intimate. The sisters made no secret of the fact that, for the right price, they offered companionship that extended beyond conversation. This wasn't unusual. Brothels and pleasure houses were common throughout the American frontier, often operating under the guise of boarding houses or saloons. Law enforcement rarely interfered unless violence spilled into the streets. The Rivera Inn, isolated and discreet, attracted men who wanted privacy. Married men, Men with reputations to protect, men who preferred their vices conducted far from the eyes of their communities. A ledger recovered from the inn's office, partially burned but still legible, shows that between June 1851 and November 1854, the Rivera Inn hosted approximately 270 documented guests. The ledger lists names, dates of arrival, and amounts paid. Most stays lasted only 1 or 2 nights. Some men returned multiple times. Others arrived and, according to the ledger, never checked out. Their entries simply end, with no departure date recorded. It's those incomplete entries that later became the focus of the investigation. 43 names without departure dates. 43 men who, as far as the ledger was concerned, simply vanished mid-stay. Among the most chilling discoveries was a series of letters found in Violeta's room, written by guests who had stayed at the inn and lived to tell about it. These letters, sent weeks or months after their visits, were effusive in their praise. One man, a merchant from Cincinnati named Theodore Gaines, wrote in August 1852, "I have traveled extensively through 6 states, and never have I encountered hospitality so warm, nor companionship so enchanting. I shall return at the first opportunity." Gaines did return, in October of that year. His name appears in the ledger with no departure date. His body was later identified as number 17 in the excavation. What's particularly disturbing is that the sisters kept these letters. They preserved them carefully, tucked into a wooden box along with locks of hair, rings, pocket watches and other personal items taken from their victims. It suggests a level of sentimentality, or perhaps trophy-keeping, that contradicts the purely financial motive that prosecutors would later argue. The community of Willow Creek, small as it was, had surprisingly little interaction with the Rivera sisters. They came into town perhaps once a month to purchase supplies, flour, sugar, lamp oil, fabric. They paid in cash, always exact amounts, never lingering to gossip. The general store owner, an elderly man named Silas Pemberton, later testified that he found them polite but cold, as if they were performing a rehearsed part rather than engaging in genuine commerce. The local church, a modest Baptist congregation, never saw the sisters attend a single service. When the pastor, Reverend Augustus Thorne, rode out to the inn in the summer of 1853 to invite them personally, Catalina met him at the door and politely but firmly declined. "We worship in our own way," she told him. Thorne later recalled feeling an inexplicable chill during the brief conversation, though he attributed it at the time to the wind coming down from the mountains. There were no complaints, no scandals, no reasons for suspicion. The inn generated tax revenue for the county. It provided a service that travelers needed, and if some of those travelers never reached their final destinations, well, the roads were dangerous. People went missing all the time. That was simply the reality of life on the American frontier in the 1850s, until Judge Harlan Pritchard disappeared, and Sheriff Clayton Mercer started asking questions that no one had thought to ask before. Judge Harlan Pritchard was not the kind of man who simply disappeared. At 53 years old, he was a pillar of Louisville society, a circuit judge known for his punctuality, his meticulous record-keeping, and his unwavering correspondence with his wife, Margaret. Every Sunday, without fail, he wrote her a letter detailing his travels, the cases he'd heard, the people he'd met. These letters were so regular that Margaret Pritchard could set her calendar by them. In January of 1855, Judge Pritchard departed Louisville on his quarterly circuit through the eastern counties. He was scheduled to hear cases in Willow Creek, then continue on to 3 smaller settlements before returning home by mid-February. He never made it past Willow Creek. His last confirmed sighting was on January 23rd, when he stopped at the Rivera Inn. The ledger shows his name in Catalina's handwriting. Judge H. Pritchard, Louisville, arrived January 23, 1855, paid 75 cents. No departure date. The entry simply ends there, like so many others before it. When February arrived and no letter came, Margaret Pritchard grew concerned. When the second week passed with continued silence, she contacted Sheriff Mercer. At first, Mercer assumed what everyone assumed: the judge had been delayed by weather or perhaps illness. Winter in the Kentucky mountains could be brutal. But when inquiries to the surrounding counties revealed that Pritchard had never arrived at any of his scheduled destinations, Mercer's concern deepened into alarm. He began retracing the judge's route. In Willow Creek, locals confirmed that Pritchard had indeed arrived and conducted court proceedings on January 24th. Several witnesses saw him that evening, heading east on the main road. The next logical stop would have been the Rivera Inn, the only lodging for 15 miles in that direction. Mercer rode out to the inn on March 2nd, accompanied by his deputy, a young man named Dalton Wells. It was late afternoon when they arrived, the sun already sinking behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the property. Catalina met them at the door, composed and gracious as always. Yes, she confirmed. Judge Pritchard had stayed at the inn. One night only. He'd left the following morning, heading east toward the mining camps. No, there had been nothing unusual about his visit. He'd been a perfect gentleman. He'd paid his bill and departed before sunrise. Mercer asked to see the guest ledger. Catalina retrieved it without hesitation. There was Pritchard's name, exactly as she'd described, but something about the entry bothered Mercer, though he couldn't immediately articulate what. The handwriting seemed rushed compared to other entries. The ink looked slightly different, and there was no departure date despite Catalina's claim that the judge had left. When Mercer pointed this out, Catalina's expression didn't change. "I must have forgotten to record it," she said smoothly. "We were quite busy that week. Several travelers passed through." Mercer glanced around the common room. It was immaculately clean. Almost too clean. There was a faint smell in the air, something sharp, and chemical that he couldn't quite place. Lye, perhaps, or vinegar. Deputy Wells noticed it too, wrinkling his nose slightly. "Where is your sister?" Mercer asked. "Violeta is upstairs, unwell. A winter fever. I'd prefer not to disturb her." Mercer nodded but filed the information away. Something felt wrong. He couldn't name it, couldn't prove it, but 30 years of law enforcement had given him an instinct for deception, and Catalina Rivera, despite her calm demeanor, was hiding something. Over the next week, Mercer conducted a thorough investigation. He interviewed every traveler who'd stayed at the Rivera Inn and lived to report it. The accounts were remarkably consistent. The sisters were charming, the accommodations adequate, the food acceptable. Most men admitted, with varying degrees of embarrassment, that they'd paid for more than just a bed. But no one reported anything suspicious, no violence, no threats, no reasons for concern. Yet Mercer couldn't shake his unease. He began cross-referencing the inn's ledger with missing person reports from surrounding counties. What he found was staggering. Over the past 3 years, at least 19 men had been reported missing after traveling through the Willow Creek area. 19 men, whose last known location placed them somewhere along the road where the Rivera Inn stood. 19 wasn't conclusive. The roads were dangerous. Bandits operated throughout the region. Men died from exposure, from accidents, from disease. But 19 was enough to warrant further investigation. On March 16th, Mercer returned to the inn with a warrant to search the property. This time, he brought 4 deputies and a magistrate from Louisville. Catalina received them with the same unnerving composure. She offered no resistance as the men spread out across the property, searching every room, every outbuilding, every storage space. They found nothing. The inn was spotless. The guest rooms showed no signs of violence. The kitchen was orderly. The root cellar contained only preserved vegetables and salted meat. After 6 hours, Mercer was ready to concede defeat. Perhaps his instincts had been wrong. Perhaps Judge Pritchard had simply met with foul play elsewhere after leaving the inn. It was Deputy Wells who noticed the inconsistency. Standing in the yard behind the main building, he observed that the ground seemed uneven. There were patches where the grass grew thin and pale, as if the soil beneath had been recently disturbed and hastily reseeded. Wells called Mercer over, and the two men stood there in the fading light, staring at what appeared to be a rectangular depression in the earth, roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, the shape of a grave. Mercer ordered his men to dig. Catalina, watching from the back porch, said nothing. Her face remained expressionless as the shovels broke ground. Violeta appeared beside her, pale and silent. The two sisters stood together, hand in hand, as the first body was unearthed. It was wrapped in canvas, tied with rope. The decomposition was advanced but not complete. The clothing suggested a man of some means: wool trousers, a cotton shirt, leather boots. In the pocket of the trousers, they found a silver pocket watch, engraved on the back, "To Harlan, with love, Margaret." Judge Pritchard had been found, but he was not alone. Mercer ordered a full excavation of the property. As darkness fell, they lit torches and continued digging. By midnight, they'd found 5 more bodies. By dawn, the count had reached 12. The deputies worked in shifts, their faces grim, their hands blistered. And throughout it all, the Rivera sisters stood watching, still holding hands, still silent. When a deputy finally approached them to make the arrest, Catalina spoke for the first time in hours. Her voice was soft, almost conversational. "Are you going to dig up the ones in the forest too?" she asked. "Or just the ones we buried close to the house?" The word sent a chill through every man present. Deputy Wells later testified that in that moment he understood they weren't dealing with ordinary criminals. These women had been methodical, patient, and utterly without remorse. Pause here and tell us in the comments, what do you think really happened to these men? What could drive 2 women to commit such systematic horror? We want to hear your theories. The excavation would continue for 2 more weeks, and the final body count, 43, would shock not just Kentucky, but the entire nation. The excavation of the Rivera Inn property became one of the largest forensic operations Kentucky had ever witnessed. Sheriff Mercer requisitioned additional manpower from 3 surrounding counties. By March 20th, over 20 men were working the site, carefully gridding the property and systematically examining every suspicious mound, every depression, every area where the soil looked disturbed. The bodies were found in 3 distinct zones. The first, and most concentrated, was directly behind the main building, an area roughly 40 feet square where 17 graves were discovered. These were the most recent victims, buried within the past 18 months. The decomposition was such that some could still be identified through personal effects: a Masonic ring belonging to a merchant from Tennessee, a monogrammed handkerchief belonging to a doctor from Virginia, a leather satchel containing surveying equipment traced back to a land assessor from Ohio. The second zone was deeper into the property, near the tree line where the cultivated land gave way to forest. Here they found 13 more graves, older and more deteriorated. These victims had been dead for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Identification was nearly impossible. The elements and wildlife had done their work. But the presence of coins, belt buckles, and boot remnants confirmed that these too were human burials, not animal remains or natural casualties. The third zone was the most disturbing. Following Catalina's cryptic comment about the ones in the forest, deputies ventured into the woods behind the property. Half a mile from the inn, they discovered a natural ravine, a depression in the land where rainwater collected and drained toward a creek. In this ravine, concealed by undergrowth and fallen leaves, they found 13 more bodies. These were the oldest victims, buried so long ago that only skeletal remains survived. But the manner of burial was different here. These bodies hadn't been wrapped. They'd simply been dumped into the ravine and covered with brush. The discrepancy in burial methods suggested an evolution in the sisters' methodology. The early victims, those in the ravine, appeared to have been disposed of hastily, with minimal effort to conceal them. But as time progressed, the burials became more deliberate, more carefully hidden. It was as if the sisters had learned from experience, refined their technique, grown, more confident in their ability to hide their crimes. Catalina and Violeta were arrested on March 17th and transported to the county jail in Willow Creek. They were housed in separate cells, a deliberate strategy by Mercer to prevent them from coordinating their stories. For the first 3 days, both women refused to speak. They sat in silence, accepting food and water, but offering no explanations, no confessions, no defenses. It was Violeta who broke first. On the evening of March 20th, she requested to speak with Reverend Thorne. The pastor, who had once been turned away from the inn, now found himself sitting across from a confessed murderess. What Violeta told him that night would form the basis of the prosecution's case, though much of it would later be disputed and questioned. According to Violeta's account, the killings had begun not as premeditated murder, but as self-defense. She claimed that in June of 1851, only weeks after they'd opened the inn, a prospector named Caleb Drummond had become violent after drinking heavily. He'd attacked Catalina, attempting to force himself upon her. In the struggle, Violeta had struck him with a cast-iron skillet, killing him instantly. The sisters, terrified of being blamed and knowing that the legal system rarely favored women in such circumstances, had buried him in the forest and said nothing. But then, Violeta claimed, something changed. When they searched Drummond's belongings, they found over $300 in gold, more money than the sisters had seen in their entire lives. The temptation was too great. The isolation of the inn, the transient nature of their clientele, the lack of oversight, it all created a perfect opportunity. Why work for pennies when men walked through their door carrying fortunes? Reverend Thorne, shaken by the confession, asked Violeta how many men they had killed. She stared at him for a long moment before answering. "I stopped counting after the first year," she said. "Catalina kept better records than I did." This statement would prove crucial. It suggested that Catalina was the dominant partner, the planner, the one who maintained control. Prosecutors would later argue that while both sisters were guilty, Catalina bore the greater responsibility for transforming an isolated act of violence into a systematic murder operation. Among the evidence recovered from the inn was a leather-bound journal found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Catalina's bedroom. The journal's contents would become the most controversial piece of evidence in the entire case, simultaneously providing insight into the sisters' motivations while raising more questions than it answered. The journal was not a confession in the traditional sense. It contained no admission of guilt, no explicit descriptions of murder. Instead, it read like a ledger, a business record documenting transactions, observations, and what can only be described as customer evaluations. The entries were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with occasional phrases in what linguistic experts later identified as Portuguese. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical in its consistency. The earliest entry was dated July 4th, 1851. It read, "Independence Day, how fitting. We are finally free." The entry contained no further explanation, but subsequent entries began to reveal a pattern. Men were categorized by certain criteria: their apparent wealth, their traveling, companions or lack thereof, their physical strength, their level of intoxication, their likelihood of being missed. An entry from September 1851 read, "Timber merchant from Indiana. No wedding ring. Carried deed to property in Madison County. Boastful. Claimed no family awaited him. Violeta found him disagreeable. Departed before dawn." The clinical language was chilling. Departed almost certainly meant murdered and buried. Another entry from March 1852. Young surveyor, perhaps 25 years. Too curious. Asked too many questions about previous guests. Pleasant enough but observant. Risk assessed as moderate. Violeta argued for mercy. I prevailed. Buried near the oak tree. The journal revealed that the sisters had developed a methodology. They preferred victims who traveled alone, who had no fixed addresses, who carried their wealth with them. They avoided local men, knowing that disappearances close to home would attract immediate attention. They particularly targeted men. Heading west toward the mining territories, prospectors, speculators, adventurers who might easily be assumed to have been killed by bandits on the road ahead. The method of killing varied, but certain patterns emerged from forensic examination of the bodies. Many showed signs of poisoning, likely arsenic or strychnine, both readily available in the 1850s for pest control. Others had been suffocated, evidenced by fractured hyoid bones and petechial hemorrhaging. A smaller number showed signs of blunt force trauma or stabbing. In almost every case, the victims appeared to have been taken by surprise, killed in their sleep, or in moments of intimate vulnerability. What disturbed investigators most was the journal's tone. There was no remorse, no moral wrestling, no indication that Catalina viewed her actions as wrong. If anything, the entries suggested a kind of satisfaction, not sadistic pleasure in the act of killing itself, but pride in the efficiency of the operation, in having created a sustainable system that generated income while eliminating risk. One entry from November 1853 was particularly revealing. Violeta grows troubled. She speaks of dreams, of voices in the night. I remind her that we do what we must to survive. Every man who has entered this house has done so seeking to use women for his pleasure. We have simply turned that transaction to our advantage. If that makes us monsters, then we are monsters born of a monstrous world. This passage would be cited repeatedly during the trial as evidence of Catalina's cold rationality and her influence over her younger sister. Defense attorneys would later argue that Violeta had been coerced, that Catalina had manipulated her through a combination of familial loyalty and psychological domination. But prosecutors maintained that both women had participated willingly, that the murders had been collaborative efforts requiring coordination and mutual trust. The journal also contained financial records. By Catalina's accounting, the sisters had accumulated over $8,000 from their victims over 4 years, an enormous sum in 1850s America. Some of this money had been hidden on the property in various caches. Some had been deposited in banks in Louisville under false names. Some had been converted to property deeds and investment certificates. The sisters had been planning for the future, building wealth that would allow them to eventually leave the inn and establish themselves elsewhere with new identities. The most haunting entry in the journal was the last one, dated February 18, 1855, just 2 weeks before Judge Pritchard's disappearance prompted the investigation. It read simply, I believe we have become careless. Violeta insists we must stop. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps we have tempted fate long enough. But there is one more who arrives tonight. One more, and then we rest. That entry, investigators concluded, likely referred to Judge Pritchard. He may have been intended as their final victim, the culmination of their murderous enterprise before they retired into comfortable anonymity. Instead, he became the victim whose disappearance finally brought their crimes to light. As the trial date approached, Prosecutors assembled a case built on three pillars: physical evidence, documentary evidence, and survivor testimony. Each pillar revealed different aspects of the sisters' operation and raised troubling questions about how they had evaded detection for so long. The physical evidence was damning. Beyond the 43 bodies, investigators found numerous tools that appeared to have been used in the commission of the crimes. In the root cellar, hidden beneath false panels, they discovered a collection of personal items taken from victims: 17 pocket watches, 9 rings, 6 daggers, multiple leather wallets and coin purses, and a disturbing assortment of clothing: shirts, vests, even pairs of boots. These were trophies, keepsakes taken as remembrances of each kill. More significantly, they found bottles of arsenic trioxide, labeled as rat poison, but present in quantities far exceeding what would be needed for pest control. Chemical analysis of residue in cups and glasses found in the guest rooms confirmed the presence of arsenic compounds. The sisters' methodology became clear. They would serve their victims poisoned drinks, waiting until the poison took effect before finishing the job through suffocation or other means, if necessary. The root cellar yielded another horrifying discovery: a small furnace, unusual for a structure of that type. Initially, investigators assumed it was for heating during winter, but further examination revealed human bone fragments in the ash. Some victims, it appeared, had not been buried whole. Smaller bones, fingers, toes, teeth, had been burned to prevent identification. This level of premeditation suggested not impulsive violence, but calculated murder designed to eliminate evidence. Survivor testimony provided context to the physical evidence. Over 30 men came forward claiming to have stayed at the Rivera Inn and escaped unharmed. Their accounts painted a disturbing picture of seduction and selection. The sisters, they reported, were extraordinarily attentive to certain guests while remaining distant from others. They would ask probing questions. Did the traveler have family? Was he expected somewhere? Did anyone know his exact route? One survivor, a merchant named Elias Farnsworth, testified that in October 1854 he had stayed at the inn for 2 nights. On the second evening, Catalina had offered him a glass of wine, which he had declined due to stomach troubles. She had seemed momentarily irritated, but quickly recovered her composure. That night, Farnsworth heard sounds from the room next to his: muffled cries, then silence. In the morning, he noticed that the guest in that room, a prospector he'd spoken with the previous day, was gone. The sisters claimed the man had left before dawn. Farnsworth, unsettled, departed immediately after breakfast. "I convinced myself I had imagined it," Farnsworth told the court, his voice shaking. "I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but I knew, deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong." His testimony raised an uncomfortable question. How many people had suspected something but said nothing? How many had noticed inconsistencies, heard strange sounds, observed suspicious behavior, yet convinced themselves it was none of their business? The isolation of the inn had been one protective factor, but social reluctance to interfere, to accuse respectable businesswomen of heinous crimes, had been equally powerful. The documentary evidence, particularly Catalina's journal, sparked intense debate among legal experts and early criminologists. This was, they argued, one of the first documented cases of female serial killers in American history who operated not from psychological compulsion, but from calculated financial motive. The journal revealed no signs of insanity, no evidence of delusion or psychotic break. Catalina wrote with clarity and purpose, viewing murder as a business decision rather than a moral transgression. Dr. Edmund Hartley, a physician from Philadelphia who studied the case, published a paper in 1856 titled "On the Nature of Female Criminal Depravity." In it, he argued that the Rivera sisters represented a unique category of Criminal, women who had internalized the transactional nature of their position in society and weaponized it. They recognized, he wrote, that men viewed them as commodities, as objects for purchase and consumption. They simply inverted the transaction, taking not just money, but life itself. Hartley's analysis was controversial, seen by some as overly sympathetic to murderers and by others as a groundbreaking exploration of how social conditions could produce extreme criminal behavior. This debate would continue for decades, with criminologists returning repeatedly to the Rivera case as an example of methodical, profit-driven serial murder. As more evidence emerged, three competing theories developed about the sisters' true motivations. The first theory, favored by prosecutors, was pure greed. The sisters had discovered an efficient method of accumulating wealth and had pursued it ruthlessly. Any psychological justification was merely post hoc rationalization for ordinary avarice. The second theory, advanced by some defense supporters, was traumatic origin. Whispered rumors suggested that the sisters had suffered abuse in their youth, perhaps in New Orleans, perhaps elsewhere. The murders, in this interpretation, were acts of displaced vengeance against all men, with financial gain being a secondary benefit. The third theory was the most disturbing, that the sisters had been acting as agents for a larger criminal organization. Some investigators noted that $8,000, while substantial, seemed insufficient reward for 4 years of systematic murder and the attendant risks. They suspected the sisters might have been funneling money, documents, or even victims themselves to Confederates elsewhere. This theory was never proven, but it lingered in the public imagination, feeding speculation about wider criminal conspiracies operating throughout the frontier territories. The truth, as is often the case, likely contained elements of all three theories. But the sisters themselves would provide no definitive answers. Catalina maintained her silence throughout the investigation and trial. And Violeta's confessions were so inconsistent, changing details, retracting statements, alternating between remorse and defiance, that they were deemed unreliable by most observers. What remained undeniable was the magnitude of their crimes. 43 confirmed victims, possibly more, 4 years of undetected murder. A betrayal of the most fundamental human trust. The trust a weary traveler places in those who offer shelter. The trial of Catalina and Violeta Rivera concluded in August of 1855. Both sisters were found guilty of multiple counts of murder. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Judge Nathaniel Crawford, presiding over what he called the most heinous case to ever come before this court, sentenced both women to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for October 15, 1855, but the story of the Rivera Inn did not end with their convictions. In fact, the property and its terrible history would continue to yield dark secrets for over a century. The sisters were hanged together on a cold October morning. A crowd of nearly 500 people gathered to witness the execution, the largest public gathering in Willow Creek's history. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe Catalina as silent and composed to the end, refusing the ministrations of Reverend Thorne. Violeta, by contrast, wept continuously and reportedly whispered prayers in Spanish as the nooses were placed around their necks. Neither woman made a final statement. When the trapdoors opened, Kentucky's most notorious female criminals dropped into history. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the edge of the county cemetery, as far from consecrated ground as local church authorities could arrange. For years afterward, people claimed the graves glowed faintly at night, though no credible witness ever confirmed this. The Rivera Inn itself was seized by the county and put up for auction in November 1855. Not a single bid was placed. The building stood empty for 3 years, slowly deteriorating. Local children were forbidden from going near it. Stories began to circulate. Lights seen in the windows at night, screams heard echoing from the empty rooms, figures moving through the overgrown yard. Whether these were genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the overactive imaginations of a traumatized community, the inn acquired a reputation as a cursed place. In 1858, the county authorized the building's demolition. Workers who participated later reported feeling overwhelming dread while dismantling the structure. One worker, a German immigrant named Klaus Brenner, claimed to have found a hidden compartment in the wall of Catalina's bedroom containing 3 more journals. He turned them over to Sheriff Mercer, who was still in office. Mercer read the journals privately, then locked them in the county archives with orders that they remain sealed for 50 years. He never publicly disclosed their contents, saying only that some knowledge is too dangerous to share and some evil too profound to expose to the light of day. Those journals, if they truly existed, vanished from the archives sometime in the 1890s. To this day, their whereabouts remain unknown. The land where the inn once stood remained vacant for decades. In 1923, a farmer named Oscar Pritchard, distant relation to the murdered judge, purchased the property intending to clear it for cultivation. While preparing the land, his workers made a disturbing discovery: a small network of tunnels beneath where the inn had stood. The tunnels were narrow, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and extended roughly 30 yards from the main foundation toward the forest. The purpose of these tunnels remains a matter of speculation. Some historians believe they were escape routes, allowing the sisters to flee if authorities came calling. Others suggest they were used to transport bodies from the house to burial sites without being seen from the road. The most disturbing theory, proposed by a folklorist in the 1970s, is that some victims may have been kept alive in these tunnels before being killed, though no evidence supports this claim. Pritchard abandoned his plans to farm the land. The property was eventually absorbed into a state forest preserve in 1954, and the entrance to the tunnels was sealed with concrete. In 1967, a graduate student named Rebecca Thornton from the University of Kentucky received permission to conduct an archaeological survey of the site as part of her thesis on 19th-century criminal history. Her excavation uncovered several items that had been missed in the original 1855 investigation: more personal effects, fragments of clothing, and, most significantly, bones. Forensic analysis revealed that these bones belonged to at least 3 individuals who had not been part of the original count of 43. This discovery reignited debate about the true number of the Rivera sisters' victims. Had there been 46 murders? 50? More? Without complete skeletal remains or identifiable personal effects, the question remained unanswered. Thornton's excavation also uncovered something unexpected: children's toys. A small wooden horse, a cornhusk doll, a tin soldier. These items were found buried near the foundation in what appeared to be a deliberately created cache. Carbon dating and stylistic analysis placed them in the 1840s, before the sisters had even arrived in Kentucky. This discovery suggested that the property might have held dark secrets even before the Rivera Inn was established. Local historians began investigating the previous owner, Essie Holcomb, and her late husband. What they found was troubling. The Holcombs had lost 2 children to fever in 1848 and 1849, but no death certificates could be located. Neighbors from that era, interviewed in the 1960s when some were still alive, recalled the Holcomb children as sickly and rarely seen. One elderly woman, nearly 90 years old in 1968, claimed she had always suspected something wrong in that house, long before those Rivera women ever set foot there. Could the property itself have been cursed? Had the land attracted evil or created it? These questions fascinated paranormal researchers throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Several investigations were conducted, though none produced definitive evidence of supernatural activity. What they did produce was testimony from local residents spanning multiple generations, all reporting feelings of unease when near the site. In 1982, the final documented discovery was made. A pair of hikers exploring the state forest stumbled upon a deteriorated leather bag wedged into a hollow tree approximately 1 mile from where the inn had stood. Inside the bag were gold coins dated 1852 through 1854, several pieces of jewelry, and a folded piece of paper. The paper, badly damaged by moisture and time, contained a partial list of names written in a hand that forensic document analysts matched to Catalina Rivera's journal entries. 19 names were still legible. 13 of them matched known victims from the original investigation. 6 did not appear in any records, not in the inn's ledger, not in missing person reports, not in any documentation from 1855. These 6 names represented potential victims who had been so thoroughly erased from existence that even in death, their disappearances had gone unnoticed and unreported. The discovery suggested that Catalina, perhaps anticipating the possibility of capture, had hidden evidence of victims she chose not to record in her official journal. Why she would keep such a list at all, why create evidence of crimes beyond what investigators could prove, remains a mystery. Some theorists suggest it was arrogance, a desire to maintain a complete record of her accomplishments. Others believe it was insurance, proof she could use to negotiate or threaten if necessary. The leather bag and its contents were turned over to the Kentucky Historical Society, where they remain today in a climate-controlled vault, available only to credentialed researchers. The 6 unidentified names have become something of an obsession for amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts. Genealogists have attempted to trace them through census records, immigration, documents, and family histories. To date, only one has been tentatively identified, a name that may belong to a Swedish immigrant who left New York in 1853 heading west, never to be heard from again. The Rivera case has been reopened twice, once in 1955 on the centennial of the discovery, and again in 2005 during a cold case review. Both investigations concluded that no new charges could be filed, no new victims definitively identified, and no remaining witnesses located. The case was officially closed as solved but incomplete. Local legend in Willow Creek, now a much larger town than it was in 1855, still speaks of the Rivera sisters. Parents warn children away from the state forest preserve. Teenagers dare each other to spend the night near where the inn once stood, and every October, on the anniversary of the execution, someone, no one knows who, places 2 bouquets of black roses on the fence surrounding the sealed tunnel entrance. 43 confirmed victims, possibly 46, perhaps more. The exact number may never be known, but what is certain is that for 4 years in the 1850s, 2 women in rural Kentucky operated one of the most systematic and successful murder enterprises in American criminal history. And if the sealed journals truly exist somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered, who knows what additional horrors they might reveal. We've reached the end of this dark journey through one of America's most disturbing chapters of true crime. The story of Catalina and Violeta Rivera, the 43 graves, and the inn where hospitality became a death sentence. But as with all the best mysteries, or perhaps the worst horrors, we're left with more questions than answers. What truly drove these women to kill? Was it purely financial greed, as prosecutors argued? The $8,000 they accumulated was substantial, but hardly worth the risk of hanging. Was it revenge, a twisted retaliation against a world that had harmed them first? Violeta's fragmentary confessions hinted at past traumas, at abuse suffered before they ever arrived in Kentucky, but she never provided details, and Catalina never acknowledged any such history. Or was it something darker still? A psychological compulsion, a need not just for money but for power, for control, for the godlike ability to decide who lived and who died. Catalina's journal entries suggest a woman who felt no remorse, who viewed her victims not as human beings but as resources to be harvested. That kind of profound disconnect from human empathy is rare, even among the most hardened criminals. To find it in two sisters, working in perfect coordination for years, is almost unprecedented. Some modern criminologists who've studied the case propose a fourth theory: folie à deux, a shared psychotic disorder where two people, usually in close relationship, develop the same delusional belief system. Perhaps Catalina, as the dominant personality, drew Violeta into a worldview where their actions were justified, even necessary. Perhaps they reinforced each other's worst impulses, creating a feedback loop of violence that neither would have pursued alone. We'll never know for certain. The sisters took their truth to the grave. The sealed journals, if they exist, remain lost. The 6 unidentified names from the hidden list may never be connected to real people, real lives, real families who wondered what became of their missing sons, fathers, or brothers. What we do know is this: the Rivera Inn stood for only 4 years, but its shadow has stretched across more than a century and a half. It reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a pleasant face, offers comfortable lodging, serves a hot meal, and smiles as it pours you a drink. The property where the inn once stood is quiet now. Trees have reclaimed the land. The sealed tunnels lie undisturbed beneath the earth. Hikers pass through occasionally, most unaware of what happened. You're there, but those who know the history report feeling something when they walk that ground, a heaviness in the air, a sense that the land itself remembers. To this day, no one knows the full truth of what happened at the Rivera Inn. 43 confirmed victims, possibly more, 4 years of systematic murder, 2 women who became America's first documented female serial killers operating as a team, and a legacy of questions that will likely never be answered. Were there other victims whose bodies were never found, buried in unmarked locations deeper in the forest? Did the sisters have accomplices who escaped justice? What happened to the money that was never recovered from the various bank accounts and property deeds? And most haunting of all, how many people suspected something was wrong, but chose to look away, to mind their own business, to convince themselves it wasn't their concern? The Rivera case stands as a dark mirror to American frontier mythology. We like to imagine the 1850s as a time of rugged individualism, of honest pioneers building communities through hard work and mutual trust. But the reality was often grimmer. The isolation that allowed communities to thrive also allowed predators to hunt. The independence that Americans prized made it easy for people to vanish without anyone noticing. And the social prejudices of the era, the assumption that women were incapable of such violence, that respectable-looking businesswomen couldn't possibly be murderers, created blind spots that the Rivera sisters exploited brilliantly. Their story asks us uncomfortable questions about how we see others, about the assumptions we make based on appearance and gender, about the price of minding our own business when something feels wrong. These questions remain relevant today, in our own era, in our own communities. So I ask you now, as we close this chapter, what do you think really happened at the Rivera Inn? Which theory feels most convincing to you? Were these women monsters born of circumstance, or did something darker drive them? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Join our haunted community of investigators trying to make sense of America's darkest mysteries. If this story disturbed you, intrigued you, or made you think, please subscribe to this channel and ring the bell for notifications. Next week, we'll uncover another forgotten horror from the shadows of American history. Another case where the official story is only the beginning, and the truth remains buried just beneath the surface. Thank you for joining me on this journey into darkness. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, the past is never as far away as we'd like to believe. Sometimes it's still there, waiting just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The Rivera Inn is gone, but its ghosts remain.